So you've built cultural capital into economic capital across your career, and it's very impressive. And I wonder, like, what are some of the things you've learned about how to make that happen?
It's so interesting. First, thanks for acknowledging that, right? Like, I think that so often cultural capital is so undervalued, even though it's required to drive every type of consumption across the board, every single, trend and, all of these trends across popular culture. But when you start talking about investing in cultural capital or translating that to, economic capital, somehow there seems to be a disconnect. And what I found is that we could have all the influence in the world, but without the infrastructure, it's really difficult to scale that. And so what I prided myself on is partnering with creators, partnering with, institutions, partnering with makers and entrepreneurs to really figure out how to translate all of that influence into not just actual investment, but sort of real equity and real enterprise on the other side of that. And I think that's been the case, like really driving the business case around cultural capital in a way that should be completely intuitive because we all experience it every day. The kind of packaging and harnessing that, and then translating that into IRR and ROI is what's been, kind of the secret sauce behind it.
So when you're going to corporations necessarily to tell these stories, number one, like, what do you think corporations should be doing to invest back in that cultural capital, and
Yeah.
how do we position ourselves as creators to communicate
Yeah.
in their language?
As a project manager, what I had to learn was how to deliver, to handle all these logistics, to influence multiple stakeholders, get things done on time, above expectation, under budget. And so much of that orientation and to do so in a way that was really driving value for everyone involved. And I think that value creation and that sort of like project and constituent management carried, through. And it actually helped me to platform a lot of not just the creative endeavors I wanted to pursue, but creative endeavors for others. It was that sort of how do we bring this all together and make a story of it? How do we make the trains run on time? And then how do we ultimately show the value for what we're
Yeah.
creating? And so I would encourage every creator, regardless of the vertical or industry, to really get smart about sort of like, how you manage your resources, how you influence everyone at the table. And in order to influence them, you have to understand what motivates them. And when it comes to investment, it's ultimately return.
You said a few things that I want to dig in on. You talked about data, knowing those numbers, and the ROI, and we're talking about creators here. If I am in my own world an influencer, I have my TikTok, I got my Instagram. At what
Mm.
point am I in a position to go to a brand? How is it? Follower count? Is it views on my stuff? Like, because I know a lot of people who want to be there, but they don't have the big
Yeah.
numbers like these
Right.
other artists.
Absolutely. It's value creation, right? So it's oftentimes, it doesn't, brands aren't just looking for who has the biggest audience. Though reach is important because your audience should be some indication of how many people you'll be able to activate and in service of some call to action from a brand. So that's why the follower account matters. But if you've got a really engaged audience and you've got deep penetration and authenticity, we often see more results coming from folks who just have very deep residency. It's the reason why, you'll see creators, influencers, or even cultural leaders both going to market in the same vertical, whether it be spirits or fashion or beauty. And you often see outsized results from folks that aren't the largest. And what is it? They're the most authentic and they are better activators in that particular space. They can influence their audience through their relationship with them to take action on something. And so, regardless of the audience size, I think you have to what do brands want? Brands want to start from the top of the funnel. They want to gain awareness, right? They want to get folks to interact. So they want people to know about their brands.
Yeah.
Then they want folks to think favorably about their brands. They want them to interact and engage. And then ultimately they want them to purchase or invest in those brands and to keep coming again and doing the same thing. And so along that funnel, think about with your audience, where can you move the needle, right? And if you can prove real qualified actions and real qualified conversions, and often creators start by seeing how they're able to get their audience to activate around a small call to action. If you're a comedian, are people coming to see you at the local comedy show? And if you can prove to a brand that your voice and your content and your engagement with them is going to lead to action on behalf of the brand, regardless of the size of the audience, brands are going to take note.
A lot of your work, Heartbeat included, has been rooted in digital innovation. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on how technology may be shaping the future of content. There's so many creators who are just going straight to YouTube or straight to, these other publishing platforms and don't need traditional media that way.
Yeah. It's interesting. So, we're in the midst of the greatest technological revolution in history, and the speed of innovation has accelerated so fast. When you think about predominant forms of media and how long radio was a predominant form of media, how long television was the predominant form of media, or, once we got the internet, how long it took to percolate, we're just seeing methods of communication and forms of consumption being interrupted and displaced much faster now, just because technology is accelerating new things faster, better. So what does that mean for creators? So a ton of opportunity. If you think about Napster and what it did to music, right?
That's
So
right.
at first there was a huge, much like the same reaction we're having to AI right now from a creative community. I'm going to be disintermediated from my audience. I'm not going to be able to sell albums anymore. Folks aren't going to be able to experience a body of work in the way that I intended. And a lot of those things are true for a time, right? But on the other side of that came a huge democratization of music, and it meant that you could be, the innovation that came after it from Spotify and YouTube and SoundCloud. It meant that discovery was not limited to a specific few A&R channels. It meant that reaching an audience was not you didn't have to be on a national broadcast or have a music video playing on one of the top cable networks in order to do so. So there was a huge amount of disruption and disintermediation. There was a huge amount of opportunity, and we're seeing the same thing, but just amplified what seems like 100x right now. So is there a ton of protection and rights concerns around NIL and voice and all of the above and the rise of AI? Will contracts look different? Absolutely. But it also means that creators are able to do things that were once reserved for studios, right? It means, creators, the cost of content production, the cost of creativity goes down, but there are also threats to the craft. And, when you think about building careers digitally, there is still, a sense of, how was that honed? Some of the talent that, I've had the good fortune to partner with, have built their careers over decades, right? Like honing it on stage, honing it with direct to audience engagement. And it's very different when you're doing that through a screen. Is it any less valuable? Maybe not to the existing audience, but there is a difference. And so, I think how craft is developed and how career is developed or monetized are two different questions. And so, so I think there could be these threats to craft, but it also, when so much is digitized, this craft holds more weight, right? Like what you put into that work and how you develop that you start to place a premium on it. But the net is tons more access and more opportunity, but also more competition, right, in the market as a result of it.
Yeah, I want to go a step deeper on that because you make me think about. I grew up in the church, and I remember there were
Same.
people. Yeah, there were people, and I'm sure you've seen it, who could sing better than anybody who's got a record deal. But they're never going to get one for whatever reason. And I wonder, then listening to you talk, just because you're good or talented doesn't mean you know how to get found. And I wonder, like, what your thoughts are on how do people get found? Because to your point, like, it's more competition now. Like, the landscape has completely changed. And to add on to that question, like, did COVID change any of that? Because now we don't need to be necessarily in New York or in LA or in some of these places
Right.
necessarily.
I was actually floored by the amount of innovation that's happening in the classroom at such a young age now, at so many of these schools, and we're based in LA. But you've got 6 and 7 year olds who are doing podcasting in these very advanced Steam studios. But in doing so, they're learning how to craft stories around themselves and actually thinking about how to monetize and how to promote those. Both scary and wildly enlightening on the other side. And so I'll say there's a different, I don't even know what the term is, right? If we were beyond digital natives, it's a complete digital first generation. And so I would say, I think that this next generation is much more savvy about discovery and promotion than perhaps those who are doing it right now at the moment, are. That being said, what is required, what it means to be a storyteller, what it means to be a creator at this moment, I believe, means being part artist, part scientist, right? Mm-hmm. Before, I think we were, and again, I was a film major, and I thought that I was going to have this like really beautiful romantic career in the arts, and I think I've had the exact career that I was supposed to have, and I fashioned myself a storyteller and a business builder, and that artist and scientist, and so you need to be engaged in story and you need to make meaning of things. Yeah. And you also have to figure out, how to mechanize that in order to get it seen and for it to be consumed. Even if you're not directly involved in digital distribution, if you are telling story in any form, if you're creating in any form, you at least need to understand how it will ultimately be distributed or consumed, right? So you have some context with what you're creating. And I think that's what I would say. I would say that that is the mandate now, right? To know the what and to be committed to the what and doing it in a way that is uniquely you, that only you can put your footprint on, but really understanding the how as well. And I don't know that was as important in, sort of previous generations.
You mentioned your kids and the kind of education they're getting today versus how we grew up. When we were growing up, they asked you want to be a fireman, you want to be a police officer, these sorts of things. And these kids now want to be Mr. Beast, and they want to be, YouTubers and Kai Cenat and I Show Speed and all these guys. And I wonder what Ty thinks about if her 7-year-old comes to her and is like, I want to be a YouTuber, therefore, I don't care about anything else. This is where I'm going.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's happened. But I don't know too many parents for whom that hasn't, just because of, and we try to be, really good stewards and not over-index on screen time. But as a parent, forget about, the executive, the entrepreneur. As a parent, I definitely have serious concerns, and not just about technology, but what technology unlocks. So clearly there's safety concerns, and you want to be really vigilant. There's a level of discernment concerns, what's real and what's not real, that I think we're dealing with for the first time, now with AI. You're watching, if someone's consuming something and they don't have a point of reference for it in the real world, or what is the real world anymore as a parent, right? There are these big kind of ethical considerations. But I think that when you talk about creators, so often what we're defaulting to in that discussion can be some kind of influence, right? But what we found the conversation we found ourselves having with our 7-year-old, who, you can see his picture right there, like such a smart kid, was the difference between fame and validation and the making of something, right? And so what do you want to make and what do you want to contribute? And, how do you want to be in the world versus how many people know you and how do you want to be seen? And that's a pressure that was not on, that children are facing en masse. It's a completely unrealistic pressure that everyone should have this level of fame and notoriety. And, I'm no psychologist, but I just wonder what that's doing to the psyche. And so as a parent, I'm really guarding against that. But I think it's a bigger question for us as a creative community, right? What is the role of craft? Now, philosophical and ethical conversations. And what I've come to is, I just want my child to be very curious minded, to be, to have a critical eye, right? and discerning, and to be a deep thinker, and to understand, and to be a deep thinker and a continuous learner. Because I think that those are and you start to default to the fundamentals. Like, I want you to appreciate philosophy. You should really be thinking about, sort of like how you show up in the world and what it means to be, a good citizen of the world. Because there's just so much more access, right? Like everything that we kind of imagine, they're able to do and touch in a much more accessible way. And so then you just have to have a higher level of discernment and critical thinking skills.
What would you study today, knowing what you now know about Ty's place in the world, your contribution that you wanted to make, wealth creation even? What choice would you make today?
That's so interesting. I would say I would probably have gone to film school. Like
Yeah.
I never got an MBA. So I would go to film school, but it would be, I would do that. I would study philosophy. And I say that because I think film school is just a more accessible way of there are lots of ways into philosophy, and there is a deep study of like how humans behave and how story is passed down, and how humans make meaning of things that happens in filmmaking, but that happens in philosophy. Because I think you have to just have a real perspective on where all this goes and why all this is, and because the tools are there. I'm so excited about how AI is, and not just AI, AR, and how AI has also let so many technologies now have its moment. I think take VR, for instance, it's having a QR code moment. Like, I used to work in marketing for years, like 10 years I worked for ad agencies, and we were always, seduced to putting QR codes on anything that folks couldn't access. And it took the smartphone to really unlock that. Like, you had to
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
the technology accessible to really be able for it to drive mass adoption, and the moment in time, right? It was like the smartphone plus COVID, and all of a sudden QR codes that we've been talking about for like 15 years had a real use case. And so what AI has done for so many technologies, really making them more scalable and accessible, and so many of the ideas that we had, can now unlock in real time. That's really, really exciting. And so the things, and I used to have the saying in every job, no matter what it was, independent of AI, I would say, let the machines do what the machines could do so the people could do what the people could do. So I didn't want to spend my time on spreadsheets or doing, tasks that could be automated. And now they're big thinking human tasks that can be automated. And so the question becomes, what do the people do in this ecosystem? And so one is to have experience, right? So you think differently about, what we experience in the real world, how we bring a human lens to the life lived, right? Like, we're the ones who get to live this life, how you bring the human experience to that. But services become so much more
Yeah.
important. We spend so much time in a virtual world, so the time that we spend together becomes so important. I've been on the board of Rock the Bells, and they do a lot of experiences. We just announced that we're bringing back our annual Rock the Bells Fest, and there's something about getting people in a room consuming music together and having a shared experience together, that can just not be replaced. It can be augmented, it can be amplified, but you can't really duplicate it completely. And so, I think, so I would really, so as machines become smarter, going back to the question, what would I study? It would probably be philosophy, to think, as things evolve, how do we evaluate ourselves? What responsibilities do we have? Where are the lines around ethics? That kind of thing.
Yes. I've been thinking about something you said a minute ago in finding your unique voice in media and marketing and et cetera. Like, I can't be Kevin Hart. I can't be Kai Cenat. I can't be those
Mm-hmm.
guys. But I think about also, how do you, as a person in your position, advise people to find their voice and have confidence in their voice when they may not have the traction in the early days, to continue to have the confidence that they will ultimately make it?
I mean, there's so many proof points and use cases around us. You look at someone like a Doechii, you look at a Tabitha Brown, where it was that being left of center or outside of what everyone was saying. It was that breaks through. And when the algorithm feeds you sameness, distinction is a delicacy, right? It's such a premium. And so you might be able to press copy, paste, and repeat on whatever the person beside you is doing, but the chances that will scale, like there are just very few proof points of I'm going to copy what that person did that is breaking through now, because there's so much. Now, could you have moderate success, or could you attribute a follower account by following the algorithm? Sure. But when you think about what it means to build a brand today, whether that's a personal brand, a creative brand, a brand in business, it's going to require some distinction. It's much harder to break through. And so I would say that like your uniqueness is all you have. It's like your number one quality. And it's counterintuitive because, being on platforms, consuming media, you'll be, enticed to think that like, let me just double click on this, but everyone who we want to emulate has stepped outside of the box, right? And so I really love seeing people, champion creativity and uniqueness in this space where, it's essentially, it can become, if we're not careful, a platform on which we mass produce creativity. And really what I think the promise of all of this new technology is, particularly AI, the promise is to be able, especially when we talk about folks who have been, disenfranchised, underinvested in the past, Black folks, women. There is this promise. We'll see if it is, fulfilled, that this could be a great equalizer in certain ways, right? We can start businesses with fewer resources. We can scale ideas in faster ways to have a more competitive edge. And that's where, not to replace the creative parts of ourselves, but to really scale, where we had those production challenges, right? Really scale where we had those, resource challenges. And unlock all these amazing and brilliant ideas that we had. And so, working on some things now that will, specifically for us, trying to make sure that we have a voice and we're represented. Because while there is that great promise, one of the great threats is, if you look at where the investment in the internet went, right, during, .com and post.com, and which innovators were platformed, they look exactly like those where the investment is trending now and who's being platformed. And so not only do we need to make sure that we're adopting, because there are disparities in our adoption of many of these tools and technologies, we have to make sure that we're garnering the investment, that we're scaling platforms that we own with these. And so there is, again, the two-sided coin. There's a huge promise or potential, should I say, for a great democratization and acceleration, but we really have to make sure that we're counted, because it could just as easily be that this is the next big, revolution where we're sort of sidelined.
And I'm glad you brought up the legendary James Todd Smith, LL Cool J, because I had a question. I was thinking about him, and I remember going to a conference that he spoke at some time ago, and he was on stage and he was talking about the business side of the music business. And I remember him saying that the word business is longer than the word music. And that's really where your attention should be if you're going to be an artist. And in listening to you talk a lot about how artists need to understand, creators need to understand that data. They need to understand the ROI. But a lot of them, as you know, they're just creators. Like, they have no clue what the numbers mean. And there's another rapper who I won't mention the name, but I remember him saying that he no longer believed artists need managers. They needed COOs. That was his thought. And I'm like, I can see that. I get it. I get the sentiment. I will say that. And so I wonder your thoughts on how creators who may not have I'm just funny, I'm just good looking and can act a little bit. Like, how do I figure that stuff out?
Right. Look, I think, so one, Todd has had a 40-year career in music, and it's interesting, sort of working closely with someone like that, because the number of times that you have to talk about a continuous learner, right? And someone who's just like relentlessly curious is probably, one of his just most admirable attributes, like the willingness to be able to like to continue to learn. And I wouldn't even say reinvent yourself, but to continue to learn and leverage everything that you learn in service of perpetuating your art and your craft and your life's work, right? To continue, you got this mission, you got this vision, and you just take everything that you come across over the course of decades and you continue to put that back in. And then you form these ideas like the one that you just expressed based on everything that you're learning. I really don't think you can afford today to be just a creator and not have some business acumen. And I say that because if we look 20 years ago, but even 10 years ago, creators, you can say creators have an opportunity to promote themselves across social, Instagram and, TikTok and Snap, but they almost have an obligation to now, right? Like you have to be able to put the work out. Even the machines that organize around us, the labels, the managers, the agents, they are still going to require you to be able to, like they have to market you through a stream. And those streams are analytical in nature, right? They're algorithmic in nature. And so it would be just it would be very difficult. Now, does that mean that everyone has to be digital first? Does that mean that everyone has to take the same approach to promotion? Or that everyone has to say, like, hey, I'm going to build an enterprise, around myself? Maybe not, right? They're going to be different flavors, just like in business. Pure entrepreneurs operate on different levels of scale. But creativity in a digital age is inherently entrepreneurial, period, regardless of how. And so there's certain tools that you'll have to use. And I talk about this sort of like spectrum regarding deal structures and return or levels of entrepreneurship in creativity, and particularly when it comes to partnering with brands. And so, on the one hand, but you could sort of extract that and apply it to, any type of partnership. You start out with endorsement. I do a thing, I get paid for a thing, and that's fine. But you still, even in this ecosystem, have to understand the economics of even how endorsements are calculated to make sure that you're thinking about it the right way. Because to your earlier point, those endorsement deals might be influenced by your reach. It might be influenced by the amount of, and it's definitely going to be influenced by the amount of return that you're able to drive. So you start with endorsement, and then you move down the spectrum to equity. So folks say, look, I'm driving a lot of value for you. Yeah. I want participation in how this thing performs beyond just, what I did in the specific campaign or what I did in the specific transaction. And then you have, really innovative entrepreneurs and creators who are now saying, no, I am, because of how because influence has shifted away from institutions to individuals. And these individual brands are now some of the fastest growing entrants in segments. You talked about Mr. Beast, and think about when was the last time the chocolate industry was disrupted, or really. So you would think, or look at Kim Kardashian, Nike right now. I mean, you see these incredible, or there's across the board. Or look at someone like Tabitha Brown, who is innovating across so many different verticals, where it could have been pure endorsement, and I'm sure she still has some endorsements, but where it's okay, like I know that through my passion, through my voice, my specific point of view, I'm able to drive these returns. And then you get all the way to enterprise. And I don't really care where you play on that spectrum, but what you notice is there's some inherent business acumen, even if you have a team managing all of that for you, that's required to know how to navigate along that path. And so, again, you could be a comedian starting out in the club. You could be a visual artist. So many of the artists that, so many of the visual artists that I discovered, I find on Instagram. And so if we think just as users, and I will say, I think the distinction between creator and consumer has also collapsed, right? Mm-hmm. Like you talked about, our children coming to us and saying, here's what I want to do. It's because every single time we post, every single time we share, we're contributing to the creator economy. So there's not that distinction. And consumers want to have a voice and expect more buy-in and expect to be able to direct more. And so I think all of this just leads to an ownership economy where we're all having to become and have an opportunity to be a lot more savvy around where we invest our time, our attention, and ultimately our money. All
right, last one. What is the best career advice you've received that would be helpful to this audience?
So it's interesting because I think I said it and I actually had to find myself taking my own advice. I always said my career was a river, not a ladder. And I think that, whether you're in corporate or you're a creator, it's really important to think that I named my son Niall, and it's, I wanted him to, for a number of reasons. But, I think there's a fluidity to how, particularly now when things are changing so fast. Before, you could go to practice the craft you were marketing, you get your MBA and, you could be a CPG marketer for 20 years and not, you could go to some professional development classes, but you don't really have to innovate a ton on what it is that you're doing. And now we have to be these continuous learners. And I found that, I told you I wanted to go to film school first. I ended up, doing aerospace and defense marketing. I would have crafted it out in a much more linear way if I was, going from point A to point B. But every single, bend in the river, every single time there was, things sped up, slowed down, it all contributed to where I am now. And every one of those experiences was so meaningful. You kind of like a river, you pick up deposits all along the way. And so I always say, be focused on where you want to go and really flexible on how you get there. And that's served me well.